I'm Jennifer. Standing in the opulent ballroom of the country club, surrounded by the shocked faces of my father's guests, I felt a strange sense of calm. The room was filled with whispers and gasps as I held up the documents that would expose my father's lies. It was a moment I'd never forget, a moment that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Let me take you back to the beginning. My mother, Lily, passed away when I was 10 due to a tragic car accident. I remember the cold hospital room, the sterile smell, and the way my father, Henry, just stared out of the window, lost in his own world. He was a successful real estate developer, always busy with deals and clients. After my mother's death, he didn't know how to handle a young daughter. So, he sent me to live with my grandmother, Amelia, in a small coastal town. Grandma Amelia was the light of my life. Her old cottage by the sea was filled with warmth and love. She taught me to paint, and we would spend hours on the beach, collecting seashells and watching the sunset. She always said I was her little artist, with a heart full of creativity. Those years with her were the happiest of my life. But when I was 12, my father remarried. His new wife, Isabella, was a socialite who cared more about appearances than anything else. She wanted me back home, to show off a perfect, complete family. I moved into their large mansion in the city, but I quickly realized I was just an outsider. My room was in a corner, far from the master suite. A year later, my half-brother, Ethan, was born, and I faded into the background. As I grew up, my father showed little interest in my life. When I graduated from art school, he didn't even attend the ceremony, saying he had an important business meeting. Meanwhile, Ethan got all the attention. When he was accepted into a prestigious business school, my father threw a huge party. I sat at the back, sipping on a cheap glass of wine, watching them celebrate the son who mattered. Every family gathering was the same. My father would look at me with disdain and ask, "Still painting? How much money can you make from that?" Isabella would pat my hand and say, "Jennifer is artistic. That's her thing." It was like a consolation prize. I kept quiet, not wanting to cause any trouble. I believed that my grandmother, too, had given up on me as I struggled to make a living as an artist. 5 years ago, my grandmother passed away. At the funeral, the mansion was filled with people, but I felt invisible. My father stood at the center, greeting guests, not showing a single sign of grief. Isabella glided around in a designer dress, introducing Ethan as the future of the family. No one introduced me. 2 weeks after the funeral, we went to the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. The office was all dark wood and leather chairs. My father sat at the head of the table, Isabella on his right, Ethan on his left. I sat at the far end. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. To my father, he left 90% of the estate to be managed as he saw fit. To me, he left a measly $5,000, just enough to buy some art supplies. My father smiled, saying, "Mother always knew what people deserved." I signed the papers, feeling completely defeated. But then, on my 28th birthday, my father showed up at my small apartment for the first time in years. He was wearing an expensive suit and holding a yellowed envelope. "Found this in Mother's things. Must have been a mistake," he said, and then he added, "She died thinking you'd never amount to anything." With that, he left. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter from my grandmother. The first line read, "If you're reading this, you've survived the darkness. I knew you would." My hands trembled as I read on. She said she had always believed in me, that my father was a liar. The letter also contained a key to a safety deposit box at the local bank. The next day, I went to the bank. The manager, a kind-looking man named Mr. Thompson, told me that the box had been opened by my grandmother 5 years ago, and I was the only one authorized to access it. He also said that my father had made several inquiries over the years, but they'd followed my grandmother's instructions and told him there was nothing. Inside the box, I found a thick folder. The first document was my grandmother's real will, dated 2 years before her death. According to this will, I was supposed to inherit a large trust fund, worth around $2 million, and a beautiful art gallery in the city that she had bought for me. There were also bank statements showing that my father had been withdrawing money from the trust, starting when Ethan entered business school. He'd used my inheritance to fund Ethan's education and his own business expansions, all while making me believe I was a failure. I was furious, but also determined to get what was mine. I contacted Margaret, an old friend of my grandmother's who was a well-known estate lawyer. She told me that my father's actions were considered fraud. She gave me two options: file criminal charges or confront my father with the evidence and negotiate a settlement. I thought long and hard. Part of me wanted to see my father behind bars, but another part, shaped by my grandmother's gentle spirit, wanted a different approach. Then I remembered the invitation to my father's 60th birthday party at the country club. It was the perfect opportunity to expose him in front of the people he cared about. A week before the party, my father summoned me to his study. He'd heard I'd been to the bank and was furious. He threatened me, saying that if I caused any trouble, it would ruin my reputation as an artist. But I stood my ground and told him I'd see him at his party. Isabella called me the next day, feigning concern. She tried to persuade me to drop the matter, saying it was for the family's sake. I just nodded and agreed to come to the party. On the day of the party, I arrived at the country club. It was filled with my father's business associates, judges, and socialites. My father was at the center, looking like a king. He gave a toast, talking about his success and the future of the family, with Ethan standing by his side. When he finished, I stood up and asked if I could say a few words about Grandma Amelia. My father's smile froze, but he couldn't refuse in front of everyone. I walked to the microphone and began to speak. I talked about how my grandmother had loved me, how she had believed in my talent. Then I pulled out the documents and revealed the truth about the real will and the money he'd stolen. The room exploded in chaos. My father's face turned ashen, and Isabella gasped in shock. Ethan looked confused, not knowing what to say. Margaret, who was sitting at a table in the back, stood up and confirmed the authenticity of the will. My father tried to defend himself, saying my grandmother was senile at the end. But Margaret countered, saying she had witnessed the will and that my grandmother was of sound mind. A judge in the room said that if what I was saying was true, my father was looking at fraud charges. I told my father I didn't want to see him in prison. I just wanted what was mine. I demanded the transfer of the trust fund and the art gallery. He was trapped, surrounded by people whose opinions he valued. In the end, he had no choice but to agree. After the party, the fallout was swift. My father's business partners started to pull out of deals, and his reputation was in tatters. Ethan came to me and said he didn't know about the money being mine. He apologized and said he was going to pay back the loans he'd taken for school. I kept my job as an artist. The money from the trust gave me the freedom to focus on my art without worrying about money. I renovated the art gallery and turned it into a place where young artists could showcase their work. I don't talk to my father anymore. He sent a message through his lawyer, blaming me for tearing the family apart. But I know that I was just getting what was rightfully mine. Grandma Amelia's love and belief in me were the driving forces that helped me through this. And I've learned that sometimes the truth has a way of coming out, even if it takes a long time.